찰스 맨슨은 단 한 번도 직접 명령하지 않았습니다. 그런데 추종자들은 7명을 살해했습니다. 착한 사람을 괴물로 만드는 6가지 심리 조종술. 지금 당신 주변에서도 일어나고 있습니다.
In 1969, Charles Manson convinced his followers to take the lives of 7 strangers without ever giving them a direct order to do any of it.
I haven't killed anyone. I didn't break the law.
And a decade later, in a jungle in Guyana, Jim Jones persuaded nearly 1,000 people to drink Flavor Aid laced with cyanide. More recently, Keith Raniere's Nexium secretly branded and enslaved women, many of whom were recruited by female friends already in the group.
And it truly haunts me to this day. How many people I brought in, my friends and family, who in turn brought in their friends and family through leveraged trust. Some of those people are still loyal to the cult to this day.
Yet different people, different decades, and different circumstances, but the same terrifying result. Good people doing unthinkable things because a manipulative leader had hacked their psychology. And it is a scary truth that these powerful psychological tricks that these cult leaders use to brainwash their followers can just as effectively be used by toxic partners, manipulative friends, and predatory organizations against people like you and me. And that is why in this video we are breaking down each of those tricks so that hopefully you can spot these red flags and avoid falling victim to them.
두 번째 전술은 가짜 가족입니다. 조종자는 당신의 외로움을 먹고 삽니다. 가족이라는 언어로 감싸는 순간 당신의 판단력은 서서히 사라집니다.
Now, one of the most powerful tricks that manipulators use is to impersonate the family unit. And by doing that, they become your main source of love and approval, which gives them an incredible amount of influence. And unfortunately, this makes people without strong family ties or support systems the easiest target. And here's how a Manson family member explains this.
I was desperately seeking someone that I could love and hold on to and call my own. That somehow my dad leaving had left a space there.
So if, like this woman, you don't have a strong family unit, you're more likely to struggle with loneliness, insecurity, and low self-worth. And that is exactly what manipulators prey upon. They know that just a few simple compliments can make that type of person feel deeply loved and accepted.
When we made love, all I remember is just crying and crying to this man. I mean, it was like, because he said, "Oh, you're beautiful." I couldn't believe that. I just started crying.
Those tiny drops of validation can be powerful enough to get someone to change their entire life. And that's why cults lean so hard into this family language.
We've seen Sister Brown here, who was blind, totally healed.
Let's laugh together with Father.
You're seeing this woman who's all of a sudden running through the church and everyone's just excited and Father's healed her.
So everyone becomes a brother, a sister, a mother, or a child. And more often than not, the manipulator takes on the role of father, which gives him all of the assumed authority that that position traditionally holds. And it's not just in conversation, you can hear this even in songs. So if you find yourself in a group that quickly refers to its members as family, that is a red flag. Now you see this a lot in military and religion, and while simply using these terms doesn't automatically mean that that group is evil, you should know that they could be subtly influencing you with it. But
두 번째 전술은 고립입니다. 짐 존스는 24시간 자신의 목소리만 들려줬습니다. 당신을 가족과 친구에게서 떼어놓는 사람이 있다면 그것이 바로 조종의 시작입니다.
just offering a fake family isn't enough. For full indoctrination, these groups need to cut you off from your real family and support system as well. And that brings us to the second psychological trick, which is isolation. Jim Jones, for instance, only got people to drink cyanide because he'd moved them to an isolated community in Guyana. He made sure that no one had any contact with the outside world or that any family or friends could have pulled them out. And instead, Jones made sure that his narrative was the only reality that existed in the minds of his followers. And he did it in a very overt and effective way.
There was a speaker system, and only Jim spoke on it, and it went 24 hours a day.
We had no other radio or TV or communication with parents or any kind of, update that could show us really that there's a whole other thing going on besides what Jim was interpreting for us.
Similarly, Charles Manson and his followers lived together on an isolated ranch, while Nexium pressured members to move to their community in New York. The reason for all this was simple. Once you're cut off from the rest of the world, your manipulator controls your reality. They can create a bubble where it feels like everyone in the world believes the same thing, and if you don't, you're the problem. And since being a problem could mean using your newfound family and all the perceived love, most people just go along with this. That same pattern often shows up in toxic and predatory relationships as well. A partner, friend, or acquaintance keeps you away from your friends and family and insists that they're the only one who understands or loves you. And even though it might not seem as dramatic as these examples that we've just mentioned, the psychology is identical. They cut you off from your support system so that they're the only ones you can lean on.
세 번째는 가스라이팅. 네 번째는 질문 금지입니다. 언어를 비틀어 현실을 의심하게 만들고 질문하는 순간 당신이 나쁜 사람이 됩니다.
And that brings us to the third psychological trick. It's one that you've likely seen before, which is someone twisting language to disguise what's really happening, also known as gaslighting. For example, someone might say something hurtful and then just laugh it off with, "Relax, I was just joking." Or they'll aggressively start an argument, and when you get upset, they'll say they're just talking things through. By twisting the language, they can make you doubt what is really happening, and you see that multiplied by 1,000-fold in cults.
My language became coded. I sounded like a Nexium robot.
People who disagreed with Keith Raniere weren't just disagreeing, they were labeled as suppressives who had supposedly undergone the fall. And by demonizing people who dared question him, he made sure that none of his other followers did the same, or else they'd be risk being branded as fallen too. Jim Jones used the same trick to convince his followers to poison themselves and their families.
We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
So why does any of this matter? Because changing a word changes the meaning behind what is being said, at least in your head. And what might have felt like manipulation suddenly sounds positive. Or something simple like disagreeing or posing questions can become bad behavior. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with using specialized words inside of a group, but if they're being used, you should be able to have an open and honest discussion about why these terms are necessary. And that brings us to the fourth red flag, which is demonizing asking questions that threaten the leader's authority. You can listen to Jim Jones berate someone in Guyana just for asking to go home.
Ask you, could I go home to make a trip to see my people? It's blasphemy. It's blasphemy to talk about going back when you have not been given any approval. Do you want to go home? No. Well, then be seated and shut your mouth and don't be in my face anymore.
At its worst, demonizing asking questions can lead to something even worse, which is the self-censoring of doubts and questions while they're still in your head. Meaning that you don't even ask the question out loud because you killed it in your head long before that. The social pressure not to ask questions can be so intense that any tiny doubt immediately triggers self-judgment and self-censure. For example, shutting down critical thinking is something this Nexium investigator noticed firsthand.
One of the things they did was to say, you need to ignore your gut instinct. You need to ignore the part of your mind that's saying this is not good because that's what's holding you back in your life. But what that does is it takes away your critical thought. If you start to question what's going on here, there's another part of your brain that starts to kick in and say, oh no, this is my issue. I always question everything. That's what's holding me back in terms of my personal growth.
So, if you find yourself in a situation where asking a simple question feels like some sort of a violation, be careful. Maybe you're reading a contract and you ask a question about it, but the other person snaps, "Are you saying that you don't trust me?" Suddenly, you might feel guilty for being so skeptical. How could you be so unkind? And you stop pushing the issue. But you shouldn't do that because that is exactly what manipulators want.
다섯 번째는 복종 보상. 여섯 번째는 빚 만들기입니다. 시키는 대로 하면 칭찬받고 거부하면 배신자가 됩니다. 이것이 컬트와 독성 관계의 공통점입니다.
So the point is, in any situation, you can remain unconvinced without being a bad, untrusting, or stupid person. But manipulators don't only punish questions. That's just the stick. They also use the carrot, which is to reward blind obedience. And it's just as dangerous a tactic. Take this example from the Manson family.
One of his things was to stop you during the day and you'd put your palms up to his and then he'd move them in any direction that he could. Or he'd make a series of faces and then you were supposed to try to keep up with them. And the whole thing was always geared toward just complete mirroring of him.
Now, it may sound silly at first, but the lesson was far from harmless. Stop thinking for yourself and start following Manson without hesitation. So in your daily life, be on the lookout for games or tests that primarily award obedience. And be careful around any organization or person that prizes blind obedience above all. Jim Jones would have his members go through mock poisonings, where those who took the fake poison were praised for being faithful and true. His conditioning was so effective that later, members of his congregation would turn in their own loved ones who were considering leaving the commune.
A father would turn in a son, a husband would turn in a wife. a small child would turn in a parent. The most forbidden thing to express was to leave.
The same goes for everyday relationships. In a toxic dynamic, you may be rewarded when you act the way that your partner wants, and iced out or punished when you don't. And the moment that blind obedience to them becomes more important than your comfort or your ability to be yourself, that's when you're in danger. In situations like these, the willingness to obey can be made even worse when the manipulator uses your desire to be fair against you. And that brings us to the sixth psychological trick, which is when someone creates the feeling that you owe it to them to behave in a certain way. Sociopaths can be excellent at triggering this feeling through fake reciprocity. That means they do, or claim to do, things for you, and suddenly you feel obligated to return the favor. Manson, for instance, swore that he'd do things for his followers that he probably wouldn't have, but you can imagine that these types of statements made his followers feel like they owed him in return.
And it was very realistic. I would die for you. And then the questions would begin, would you die for me?